Interested in creating AR apps for Microsoft's HoloLens? Then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, an immersive content specialist focused on e-learning and training. I'm also the creator and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest is Scott Montgomerie, co-founder of Scope AR, evangelist and thought leader in the AR space. Today, Scott will be sharing with us some tips on how to get started creating apps for Microsoft's HoloLens. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free and registration gives you access to all our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the Register for Free button. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. All right, Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. Why don't we start with you giving us a background of yourself? How did you get to be where you are today? Tell us a little bit about Scope AR.
Sure, sounds great. So I guess I've always loved to create things. As a kid, I wanted to be an inventor when I grew up. So I guess as an entrepreneur, that's kind of achieve the goal. I did computer science in university, and so just learned that I was a pretty good coder. And I guess my interest in AR actually goes back quite a ways as well. I actually built my first AR app in 2009. At the time, there was a financial crisis and housing was relatively cheap. And so I was investing in housing. And I wanted a way to visualize data in an intuitive way. So what I did is I built a really simple AR app that just used the camera, but you could overlay information about real estate on top of your phone camera. And so you walk around a neighborhood and see number of bedrooms and bathrooms, price history, and the like, overlaid on top of actual houses. So you could kind of see stuff in real time. I never did anything with that business, but came back to it in around 2012 when we started Scope AR. At the time, I was playing with some computer vision technology and had a customer that came to us and asked them to create a proof of concept for a training application. So this is right when the iPad 2 came out, kind of the first tablet with a camera. And we thought that was a cool idea and did this proof of concept, and it went really well. And then the customer wanted to show this at a trade show in Las Vegas. And this was a really big mining trade show, and they wanted a pair of AR glasses for it. So we actually built a pair of AR glasses. We partnered with Epson with their Montgomerie BT100s at the time, didn't have a camera on it at all. But what we did is we worked with them. We hot glued a webcam on top of the glasses and ran that to a laptop, did the computer vision calculations on the laptop, hacked the operating system of those glasses to accept the video input out of the laptop. It was this Frankenstein version of glasses with a big long cable going to a laptop. But the response from the trade show was amazing. It was a really great proof of concept. We were situated amongst all of this giant mining equipment, these machines that are 9 stories tall, and the wheels are bigger than your living room. And people kept coming up to us saying, "Oh my God, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen, by far the coolest thing at the show." And this one guy's story kind of sticks out. He says, "I've been maintaining this piece of equipment for my entire career, 35 years. And just now I've learned how to do it properly. So I've trained hundreds of other guys in the field to do it the wrong way. I've shortened the lifespan of the equipment by like half. I probably cost the company tens of millions of dollars. So how do I get this technology? It's amazing. It's revolutionary." And so for us, we thought, oh, wow, there's really something here. So we started pursuing it and got contracts with guys like Boeing and Toyota to build initial proof of concepts, again, on a variety of devices, glasses, and the like. Yeah, saw a really great return on investment with those initial use cases and decided to pursue it as a company. And really, when the HoloLens came out, it was the closest thing we'd ever seen that aligned with our initial vision for that first prototype that we built back in 2012. So yeah, we're huge fans of the HoloLens. We think it's a really great device. It's definitely more of a developer tool. There's a lot of things that need to get fixed on it. But as far as being able to prove out use cases, we are really big fans of it.
Where do you think we need to go to make AR more consumer friendly, let's say? Because you just said that it's more of a developer tool, right? So, and I agree with you. What do you think we need to do to get AR to be more of that consumer experience? I'm talking about the AR glasses, right? Not the mobile AR.
Yeah, I think we're a ways away from AR glasses. Where we focus on is enterprise. And we think that there's a much bigger market initially for that in the enterprise space. And if you look at, the strategy that Microsoft's employed recently with where they're focusing the HoloLens and the apps they're putting on, I think they agree that that's kind of the first place. And the reason is that there's real use cases. There's a real return on investment that are coming from some of the apps, especially the stuff like we're building for companies like, Lockheed Martin and Toyota. It's because the barrier to entry in wearing glasses is pretty big. And so you need a really good reason to wear it. And in enterprise, particularly in defense, in heavy manufacturing, that's where you're seeing this return on investment. But for the average consumer, there's a lot of things to overcome. And the current HoloLens is pretty bulky. We'll see what happens with devices in the future, but there's some fundamental physics that really have to be solved to get that weight down and that form factor down. If you look at Magic Leap, they were able to improve the form factor mostly by offloading the compute power to something that you wear on your belt buckle. So you've got that little compute unit, has the battery and the CPU and GPU and everything in it. That's great and all, but that's not going to work in the enterprise. And I very much doubt that a consumer is going to be okay wearing this essentially tethered device for anything more than kind of a prototype. So really what you want is a self-contained unit. The closest form factor that we've ever seen was the ODG glasses. They were really nice form factor, but they were trying to do too much in one small little package. You've got a lot of issues with just cramming stuff into such a small device. In order to have really good optics, you need power. And in order to have power, you need a big battery. In order to have a small form factor, you need a small battery. So there's a lot of competing factors. And I think technology needs to get a lot more miniaturized before it's even a consumer device. So, we'll see what Apple comes out with. If they're going to be the ones to bring out a form factor that people can live with, they're going to be the ones. But that's probably 18, 24 months away at least. So, yeah.
So what are some of the current limitations of the HoloLens from a developer's point of view?
Form factor is a big one. Personally, I can't wear it for more than about an hour before my head starts hurting. The way that it attaches to your head is it literally wraps your head in kind of a clamp. And that's fine for a few minutes, but it really starts to put pressure and you kind of start to feel like you're wearing a constricting thing on your head, and you are. So, that's really the big thing is comfort level. I think the gesture recognition has a long way to go. Magic Leap improved on gesture pretty dramatically, but the current HoloLens has pretty big limitations. Getting training somebody to do the air tap gesture is pretty unintuitive, very limited, and even kind of buggy. Some of the gestures they've got for dragging and a scale just don't particularly work that well. So I think those are really the big limitations. They've done some really great things with voice. If you think about how a user interface can work on a wearable display, gesture comes to mind, but you're going to want something that's a little bit more intuitive. You want to be able to hold stuff in your hands and kind of have it recognize the shape of your hands, essentially. The second mode of controlling a pair of glasses would be voice, which I think HoloLens does pretty well with Cortana. Of course, you can use a controller. Something like eye tracking might be interesting to maybe scroll menus and stuff like that. There's a bunch of things that I think can be improved on in short order.
Now, you mentioned the Magic Leap and obviously the HoloLens. So those are the two big ones, right, on the market. There's a whole bunch of others, but when you talk about major players, it's those two, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
So from a developer point of view, should one pick one over the other? Obviously, you picked the HoloLens, and it seems like it was a pretty good bet considering that they just had a huge deal with the Army, right, that they just sold tons of them to them. But from a developer's point of view, should a developer pick one over the other, or do they have to pick one over the other? Is there an API that they can use to write for both?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do is we use Unity, which is a really great cross-platform development environment that allows you to easily write for multiple platforms. Now, there's definitely different APIs and toolkits that differ across devices. For example, you need the Microsoft Mixed Reality Toolkit to really do most of the interesting things for the HoloLens. And then you need the toolkit for Magic Leap to do any of the interesting things for Magic Leap. But as far as your experiences and your 3D objects and all the code that's required to create that interactivity, you can write once and then compile other ways. For us, what we've done is because we target mobile apps and we target wearable displays like the HoloLens and the RealWear, we've developed an agnosticity layer. Essentially, it abstracts all of the various input methods and user interface changes across the devices, whereas the core business logic for the application is pretty much the same. So, that's one thing you could do. But if you had to choose a single device, yeah, we chose HoloLens just because of the enterprise focus. We really don't focus much on the Magic Leap at all because of their lack of enterprise focus. And because, as I mentioned, it's got that tether that has some pretty serious limitations in an enterprise environment. If you're a developer that's aspiring to build interesting experiences for consumers, I'd say that right now, the best choice is probably the Magic Leap. It's 2 years, maybe even 3 years newer than the HoloLens. It's just much more polished and you can do a lot more things. but there's lots of rumors about the new HoloLens. So we'll see what that brings.
What are some of the rumors that you heard about that are interesting from a developer's point of view?
I prefer not to comment on that.
So you have more than rumors. I see. Okay. That's fine. But I mean, does it seem like there's going to be big improvements?
Let's put it this way. I mean, the original HoloLens was launched 3 or 4 years ago. And if you think about your phone, how much has that improved in the last 3 or 4 years? Microsoft has been completely unchallenged in the market, except for recently with the Magic Leap. As far as I understand, they skipped the second version of the HoloLens because they saw that they're still dominant, and they decided to devote their resources to a next version of it versus putting those resources into kind of an intermediary version. And so, I think they were able to make a lot of progress. There's really fundamental things that need to be solved. As I mentioned, gesture control and just, this is a brand new user interface. If you think about the first iPhone, the first year and a half of the iPhone, first of all, they didn't have an app store, but when they did have an app store, the first apps were really basic. You had fart apps that made noises. You had rudimentary games that played with the accelerometer and stuff. And people were really trying to figure out how to make interesting things with this brand new device that nobody had ever really worked with. We're in the same place with AR today. We really don't know how people want to interact with AR. We have a lot of ideas, gestures, as I mentioned, potentially gaze and interact with things as you look at it. But nobody has really done the research to figure out how to make a really great app. Today on our iPhones, we have lots of great apps. We know that swipe is an amazing way to interact with phones. I mean, if the iPhone X, it doesn't even have buttons anymore. It's all about gestures. I think we're waiting for that. It's going to take a while to figure out how to make really good interactions with the device. Augmented reality as its core is a new user interface. And I think that an innovation that's as big as the keyboard and mouse were for computing is going to be required for a really great breakthrough experience.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what's your take on mobile AR, meaning mobile phones?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with mobile AR. First of all, it's much more approachable. Everybody has a phone in their pocket. You don't have to spend $3,000, $5,000 on a HoloLens or a Magic Leap. So, just by the sheer market size, you've got billions of devices that are enabled with ARKit and ARCore. I think there's some interesting things you can do with that. I think we haven't seen really interesting things yet because it's been brand new. I mean, if you think about it, we're only like a year and a half out from ARKit launching and only less than a year from ARCore launching. So if we think about going back to that App Store analogy, I would expect within the next 6 months that we start to see some really interesting things coming out from developers, having had 18 months to make mistakes and play and experiment, and then to a polished state where it comes out. So I think we're on the precipice of some interesting things with mobile AR. You've seen that Niantic, the makers of Pokemon Go, well, that's not really an AR app for any AR purists. Everybody turns off the AR in Pokemon Go. I think that they've announced the Harry Potter game and they've raised a gargantuan amount of money to be able to do whatever they're going to do. I think that's definitely a harbinger of things to come. I think you're starting to see a lot more consumer experiences where you see furniture placement apps where you can see what a piece of furniture looks like in your room. You can change your carpet. You can change the paint color in your house. So I think we're starting to see some really interesting innovations in mobile AR. And like I said, just by sheer market size, there's definitely a profit motive for people to really experiment and push the edge of what's possible with that.
So what tools should a developer learn to create apps for the HoloLens? I'm talking about tools like IDEs. What languages do they need to know?
Yeah, so we prefer using Unity as the preferred method of building AR apps in particular. It's relatively approachable. It's not the fastest for performance. If you want a really performant app, you'd probably use Unreal Engine. But if you're just a beginner, getting into Unity is really approachable. There's a free version for companies less than a certain amount. So if you're a freelancer, then you can start working on your personal edition. Getting things to work in Unity is relatively simple. It's a really great API. There's lots and lots of example code. Like I mentioned before, the mixed reality toolkit from HoloLens is really approachable and does a lot of stuff for you. It's got a lot of the user interface elements that you need pre-baked in there to allow you to build a HoloLens app as fast as possible. So that would definitely be my recommendation, is to use Unity. As far as programming languages, Unity is mostly C#. So again, pretty easy to get into language. It does all the memory management for you, a really robust API, great ecosystem.
What about web AR? Does the HoloLens support that at all? Or
as I understand it, web AR is a very nascent standard. In fact, I don't believe it's actually a standard at all yet. I think there's a bunch of people working on it from the Mozilla side and on the Chrome team. As far as web AR as a standard, I think it makes it easy to bring in 3D models and visualize. And I think you can interact with those in JavaScript pretty easily. But doing anything beyond a rudimentary app is pretty tough.
Well, the reason I mention this is because with WebVR, right, you can actually start creating virtual reality applications today. And the reason that's so exciting is because you're going to bring in a huge amount of web developers over into VR to develop, right? So the migration will be much easier for them than to have a web developer that's doing, let's say, PHP, have to learn Unity and C# and all of that versus being able to migrate into like they do with WebVR. And that's why I was thinking with WebAR, or maybe they're calling it, I believe it's WebXR now, right? Which covers the whole thing. It just seems that there should be, especially from Microsoft point of view, because they're so developer focused, there should be some sort of migration path that will encourage web developers to come in and start developing AR applications for the HoloLens.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's a really good goal to strive towards. I just don't think it's there yet.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So are there certain AR apps that do not work well for the HoloLens? Is there a particular use case that is excellent for the HoloLens, but not for other use cases?
As I mentioned, spending time in the HoloLens, you have to keep the time in the HoloLens to a minimum. So that means ideally half an hour to 45 minutes or less. So any use case that requires longer time than that is not a great use case. All of the successful use cases we've seen required something around 15 to 20 minutes. And for that, people are seeing a dramatic return on investment. But after that, there's definitely diminishing returns. I think delivery of information is really interesting. Anything where you can have simple interactions with voice control. In our applications, our killer apps are on the remote assistance side and on the guided instruction side. So on the remote assistance side, broadcasting the video stream from the HoloLens camera back to an expert somewhere else. And then that expert can annotate on the video and it will essentially raycast onto your real environment to show you what to do. That's a really great use case because now you're seeing somebody do John Madden annotations inside your HoloLens and guiding you through how to do things. And now you can work with that with your hands on it. In terms of guided instructions, now you can see full 3D models with animations showing you how to do some type of procedure. And augmented reality is a fantastic way of understanding how to do something to the point where you don't even really need to train anybody anymore. If we think about training, it's all about repetition and trying to memorize information so that you can recall it later on. But what if you didn't have to train anymore? What if you just had knowledge on demand that just showed you how to do stuff? I always liken this to that moment in The Matrix where Neo says, I need to fly a helicopter. And all of a sudden they beam helicopter instructions into his brain. Augmented reality is almost like that. Let's say Neo had a HoloLens on and it guided him on how to use the controls of the helicopter. We're almost there. There's lots of things about intuition and how to actually fly the helicopter. And actually in 5 years, there'll be autonomous helicopters anyway. So
it won't matter.
Point.
Right.
It won't matter. But the example still stays the same, right?
Right.
So in that use case, you can control the app with simple interactions, voice control, next, back, show menu, that type of thing. Those are really the great use cases. Like we mentioned that gesture control is lacking and interaction with the actual apps is lacking. So, we're at that basic stage where we're trying to find basic apps that work.
How do you test the apps in the HoloLens? What kind of testing procedures do you have? What tools do you use?
Yeah, so it's definitely challenging. The cycles to iterate HoloLens are actually pretty long, which is frustrating from a developer perspective. You want really tight iteration cycles to be able to try something, test it out. That didn't work, and then modify something and try it out. Unity and Microsoft have a really great way inside Unity to simulate a holographic environment. So you can do a lot of the testing you need in HoloLens.
In the simulator.
Actually compiling to the HoloLens is definitely painful. Essentially, the way it works is it first compiles your C# into a bunch of DLLs, then it cross-compiles that into C++ using Unity's technology called IL2CPP. That builds a Visual Studio project, and then you have to run your Visual Studio project with another compilation process, and then push it to your HoloLens. So it's pretty painful.
Question for you on that: how long is that process approximately?
That's like 15 minutes.
Yeah. So if you want to make a quick change and preview it, you're waiting 15 minutes. Yeah, I could see why that's so painful. It's not like refreshing the browser.
Exactly. So one of the things that we've done in our app is we make that rapid development a lot faster. Within our desktop application, you can build a procedure, you can publish it out to a web service, which then can be available on your HoloLens within essentially seconds. So that time to iteration is a lot faster for actually creating content. One of the big reasons that you want to see things inside a HoloLens is user interface. Does this feel right? Are my menus big enough? Should they be placed 3 feet in front of me or 5 feet in front of me or 10 feet in front of me? Where does all my things go? Again, there's not really any rules around user interface yet. Nobody has a guide for how to create really good mixed reality experiences. So it's a lot of experimentation. And if you have to wait 15 minutes to move your menu 3 feet to 5 feet in front of you, that's brutal. So some prototyping tools have recently launched that can really help with this prototyping. The names of them are escaping me at the moment, but our product designers are starting to use those quite a bit more to try to improve the user interface and be able to prototype. It's kind of like being able to mock up your iOS apps or your desktop apps in Photoshop or in one of the dedicated user interface mock-up tools. So now you can have these same sort of mock-up tools inside of the actual device and see how it feels.
So you're prototyping inside the device itself and designing the interface there. So it's an app that runs in the HoloLens.
Correct.
Yeah, and that seems the best way to go. We did an entire series on prototyping VR experiences inside of VR using Oculus Medium. I mean, it just makes total sense, right? Especially when you want that scale.
Yep, absolutely.
You mentioned already that there are really no best practices, but is anybody trying to come up with best practices for developing apps for the HoloLens? And if so, do you have any suggestions?
I think Microsoft is really paving the way, especially with that mixed reality toolkit. They definitely have the most incentive to ensure developers have all the tools they need to create as many applications as possible. So they're doing a lot of work. I know they've got a fairly extensive user experience team that's working on how to make really great experiences. And I mean, yeah, there's lots of people that are trying to do this. It's just, like I said, it's really early days right now.
Microsoft has the HoloLens and they have the MR devices, right? And they're calling those MR, which I find that interesting because I would think the HoloLens is really MR. Do you see a time when really all of this will be just one thing and you're going to be coding or developing experiences that can go from full reality to full VR?
If you think about augmented reality versus mixed reality versus virtual reality, it's really a continuum. It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to imagine a VR device that can switch to a see-through pair of glasses and all of a sudden you see your reality and now we're in augmented reality or mixed reality or whatever your definition is. Or something like the HoloLens, where it's already a see-through device and all you have to do is darken the lenses around you to get into a full VR environment. So yeah, I absolutely believe that the ultimate end state of this is a single device that's capable of augmented reality and virtual reality.
So do you suggest that developers that want to focus on AR still really try to understand VR because that's ultimately the future where it's going to be all one device?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that day is frankly quite a ways off, I think. We're probably talking at least 5 years. So if you're trying to get into AR now, pick one or the other. I mean, it's fine to experiment with both, but if you're interested in AR, stick with AR. If you're interested in VR, stick with VR. The devices for VR are dedicated VR devices, and there's lots of tools for creating VR experiences. And right now, they're substantially different.
What's a skill that you feel is extremely important to have for developing for the HoloLens? If somebody that's migrating from traditional, let's say 2D development into like AR.
I think the skill set that most translates to developing an AR is game development. You're dealing with 3D objects. You're dealing with interaction with 3D objects and motion in space. There's a lot of linear algebra and stuff like that you need to know. Then an average web programmer, for example, wouldn't really know. To be honest, linear algebra is one of those courses in university I wish I paid much more attention to because it would have been very handy in my future career choice. But yeah, I think as a game developer, it's a relatively simple transition into AR, VR development. You see a lot of gaming shops that do move into that type of development.
What about as a corporate developer, one that's just building web enterprise apps? Do they need to start focusing more on the math side, more on 3D?
One of the great things about Unity is that it does abstract a lot of that math for you. You can certainly do that hard math within it if you need to, but it abstracts it in a really nice API for motion amongst 3D objects. Yeah, I mean, web development and XR development are pretty substantially different. So, people say that when you learn one programming language, you know them all. That's kind of true, but there's definitely challenges with migrating into a completely new environment for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Any considerations from the interface point of view? What should a developer understand about building interfaces for AR versus a web app?
So I think the dimensionality is really the key. In a web interface, first of all, it's a finite space. It's two-dimensional. We understand the methods by which you interact with a web interface. It's buttons, it's text boxes, it's drop-downs. So we've essentially got 30 years of experience in designing user interfaces in that type of way. When you move into 3D, that's an entirely new ballgame. As I mentioned, we still don't really understand how a good user interface is built. Do we still want a two-dimensional interface, as in just taking your two-dimensional menus and placing them in a 3D space so that you can use some type of raycasting or pointing with your finger or even eye gazing at that menu? Is that the best way to interact with the list? I don't know. Would it be more interesting if it was kind of like a set of cubes that were laying on the floor where you could pick them up? Is that the way that people want to interact, to make a choice, to provide input? I mean, the keyboard right now, the HoloLens has a keyboard, and typing on it is absolutely painful. You have to reach out and do your air tap on that keyboard, so much so that Microsoft actually doesn't recommend it. They recommend using the Bluetooth pointer, but even that, it's a one-click thing. It's like if you're a grandma and you're using your index finger to hunt and peck on your keyboard. It's a horrible way to enter text information. That's a problem that hasn't been solved yet. So there's a lot of things here that we got to figure out. To be honest, I don't have the answer. Like I said, it's a lot of experimentation. I think developers are developing really good apps, do a lot of prototyping. One of the challenges, and I think one of the reasons why there haven't been some breakthrough XR apps yet, is because we started with really basic web interfaces when the web started. Any old hacker could create a text interface to build, a basic interface. Then as we moved into kind of the early 2000s, we had much better design, but it was still programmers that were building design. So then later on, we brought in user interface designers and graphic artists to start making much more beautiful interfaces. And so that was definitely an evolution. Today, our expectations are that you have really nice, refined iPhone level experiences. And that's a very multidisciplinary thing, especially when you're moving from 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions. So, what are the gestures? What are the really nice things? The iPhone has a lot of animations that just make it nice, that it feels nice to use. What are those animations and the interactions that make an XR app feel nice? As far as I know, those don't exist yet, or they're not well defined.
Right.
There's no rules. We need those UX designers, the graphics designers, coupled with the programmers, interaction designers, come together to define these sort of interactions. And that's pretty challenging.
What I'm hearing really is, if you're a traditional developer, like a 2D developer that is considering moving into not just AR, but VR as well, and you're expecting standards and best practices, you might want to reconsider moving into this new arena, right? But I think that's what makes it kind of exciting also from a developer point of view, is that you're defining almost the standards, right?
Absolutely. That's what's so exciting. It's wide open. It's kind of like the World Wide Web was in the late 90s.
No, I remember with the blink tag. I mean, I started back then.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. We're at that stage. There's a lot of stuff here, and it's just starting to get better and better. And there's really cool things you can do with AR. And it's a really exciting place to be.
We're almost out of time here, but if you could give one tip or one recommendation to a developer looking to migrate into developing apps for the HoloLens, what would that be?
I think the best way to get started with something is just to have an initial concept. When I started coding, I built a really simple game. It was a Java-based game. It was based on the old stock ticker game. And that was my North Star. For some reason, I chose that and I just wanted to get it done. And so I hacked at it as much as possible to just learn how to code. And so, the journey was the goal in and of itself. I wanted to learn how to code, but also to learn how to build a basic game in Java. So I think you just need to come up with an idea, a concept, and then go for it. Jump in. There's no better way to learn than to jump in and learn as you go. As we've talked about throughout this podcast, there are no defined standards. There's no right way to do a lot of this stuff. There's guideposts. There's the mixed reality toolkit that gives you really nice predefined interactions and things you can use as a base for whatever you're going to create. But just try it out.
Definitely. Well, I have one last question for you, which I asked all of my guests. It's usually, what would they like VR to be if they had full control over the outcome? I'm going to ask you a slight different one, which is, what would you like the HoloLens to be if you had full control?
I think the biggest thing for me, everybody's ideal state for AR glasses is a pair of sunglasses. It's something that is light. It wraps around your head. It's got full degree field of view. It augments your reality in a seamless way. If you take those glasses off and you look at real reality, you wouldn't believe that, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's everybody's ultimate end state. Now, we are pretty far away from that. As I mentioned, the HoloLens has a pretty limited field of view right now. Gesture interaction for how you interact with that is not yet mature. The form factor is still bulky and heavy. You're not wearing it all day long. There's a lot of cultural issues around having a camera on, and augmented reality requires a camera currently to function. And there's a lot of privacy issues around that. But I think ideally the end state is that pair of AR glasses that just feels good to wear.
All right, Scott. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I really want to thank you for being on the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I really appreciate that.
No problem. Thanks a lot. And thanks for having me.
Now, if people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give your website URL? Do you want to give email? Whatever you like.
Yeah, you can find me at www.scopear.com, SCOPEAR.com. or our Twitter handle at ScopeAR.
Well, thanks again, Scott, and to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. Just a quick reminder, if you want access to all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more, register for free at howtocreatevr.com. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltSpaceVR and subscribe to our channel. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.